because we've been working with a book here for the past month and a half here called The War for Kindness, right? That could be the theme song for this book. The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World by Jamil Zaki. And last week we were focusing on how we might go about building empathy, but so far we've only covered technology and techniques for building empathy that are aimed at individuals. And last week I mentioned that those are the kind of tools that really only work for people who are willing to use them, willing to give it a try. So that's a little bit of a challenge. How do we get it beyond just the people who are already open to becoming more empathetic? So here's how the challenge is described in the book. He says, the psychologist Dan Batson stressed out seminary students one at a time, and their empathy plummeted. My colleagues and I convinced one person at a time that they could grow their empathy, and in response, they did. Tony McAleer counsels hate group members one at a time, and Raymond Marr studies how fiction helps people understand each other, one reader at a time. Emphasis on one person at a time. Not everybody gets to be a part of those projects, right? Not everybody wants to put on a set of virtual reality goggles, right, and look around and experience what it's like to be a homeless person or an immigrant or a refugee or things like that. Not everybody wants to learn how to do loving kindness meditation or metta meditation, which has proven to be so effective at building empathy. So, how do we reach more people? Well, here's what the author suggests. First of all, he points out, we don't live in a vacuum. We're part of a larger world governed by social norms. The beliefs, attitudes, and customs shared by our communities and institutions. Norms affect us all, affect us in all sorts of ways. People find foods tastier, faces more attractive, and songs catchier when others like them. We litter and vote more often after learning that others have. The extent to which a scandal outrages us, a political candidate invigorates us, or climate change frightens us depends on how people around us feel. I know we like to deny that we're influenced, that we follow the crowd, but it is far more powerful and, how should we say, subversive than we realize. It's all about changing or reforming our social norms. What has to change is nothing less than the entire culture. The beliefs, the attitudes, the customs shared by our communities and institutions, those are the things that have to change if we're going to reach more people. So we ask the question, are those beliefs that are shared by our institutions and cultures, are those beliefs based on values like kindness, compassion, and empathy, or are they based on greed, selfishness, and contempt? Right now, I think we can say that there are some strong cultural norms that run against empathy and kindness and compassion. We're told that success requires cutthroat competition, indifference to the needs of others, and maybe even outright cruelty. And the poster child for this mentality is Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street, who said, greed is good, greed is right, greed works, greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Now, this is a fictional character, but there's no denying that he's capturing an attitude that was very real, starting back in the 80s and continuing on till today. Now, fortunately, there is very strong evidence to show that this is all a myth. and that the opposite is actually true. The truth is that people who are kind and empathetic are more likely to succeed in life in a number of ways, not just economically, but including economically. The problem is that our cultural norms are stuck in the myth rather than in the truth. The empirical truth as measured by sociologists and psychologists. And that can happen. Our norms can get stuck in a myth and ignore what is actually the truth. Now, this is a rather long quote from the book, but I think it really helps to sum up what he's getting at rather nicely. He says, organizations that emphasize kindness flourish, even when it comes to the bottom line. In 2012, Google found that its most successful teams were unusually people-oriented, composed of individuals who tuned into one another's feelings and supported each other. The design and consulting firm IDEO encourages employees to set aside time to help colleagues and considers generosity during hiring and promotion. Any organization, private or public, large or small, loose or formal, can move in this direction. We are not merely individuals fighting to empathize in a world of cruelty. We are also communities, families, companies, teams, towns, and nations that can build kindness into our culture, turning it into people's first option. We don't just respond to norms, we create them. That's what has to happen. Creating norms, or as I like to call it, shifting culture. Turning kindness into our first option. And this is by no means a recent development. People have been trying to shift culture and change the norms of culture for thousands of years to try to build empathy and kindness in the culture. Anyone here remember a guy named Jesus? Huh? Jesus, the guy who was quoted as saying lots of things about kindness, compassion, and generosity. Now you want to talk about someone who was trying to shift culture and create new norms. And it's certainly no mystery what Jesus thought that the norms of a culture should be. You don't have to be a Bible scholar and engage in an esoteric and highly technical interpretation of the Gospels. It's all there in plain language, right? A good place to start. Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount. He's speaking to huge crowds from the mountainside, and this is where he lays out the Beatitudes. Who are the blessed ones supposed to be in the culture that Jesus wants to create? What were the norms that he wanted to see them create and adopt in that culture? Well, blessed are the poor in spirit, the very opposite of greed. Blessed are the meek, not the arrogant, loud, noisy bullies. Blessed are the merciful, not those who are cruel, vindictive, and focused on revenge. Blessed are the peacemakers, not those who think violence solves problems. That's all in one chapter of Matthew. And at the end of this passage, you actually see him calling out the prevailing norms of the culture. There's a series of statements where Jesus starts out saying, you have heard that it was said. You have heard people saying, you shall not murder. So he identifies the old prevailing norm, and then he switches to the new norm that he wants to put in its place. So he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not murder. But I say to you, you should not even be angry with someone. You should not even insult a brother or sister. Now he sounds a bit extreme here, but he was clearly a passionate man. He said, and I quote, if you say to someone, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. All right, that's pretty clear. He says it's not enough to refrain from killing. We need to get a handle on our anger and even stop with the insults and the name calling. He goes on to say that you have heard that it was said you should love your neighbor and hate your enemies, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, offer the other one as well. clear and precise as can be. This is strong stuff, and he never ever tries to water it down later or back off on it or suggest that any of this is optional. He had this vision for the world where these were the norms and values of the society. And he called this world the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven. So the people who would be a part of that world, obviously, were the ones who would practice those values. Now later on in Matthew, getting towards the end of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, he gives even more examples of these new norms. And this is a powerful passage I want to share here. He says, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.' And then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?' The king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" I still keep hearing people loudly proclaiming that America is a Christian nation. How come I never hear evangelical Christian leaders talk about any of this, much less model it? You know, Jesus talks about the kingdom prepared for you, where things are going to be this way. The kingdom prepared for you. Martin Luther King called it the beloved community. In Unity, we refer to it as a world that works for all. And in the book, Jamil Zaki refers to it as a kind system. A kind system. He says that those of us in power have a responsibility not only to be kind, but also to create ecosystems in which kindness is expected and rewarded. Schools, police departments, families, companies, and even governments can take this approach, make empathy easier for the people within them. That's how we reach more people, by modeling, by being examples. And he cites in the book several real-world examples of how that's happening. I want to close today by highlighting two of them. So, meet Sue Rahr, who started off as a deputy sheriff in Seattle, Washington, and went on to become the head of police training for the entire state of Washington. Every police officer, sheriff, state police, whatever, has to go through this training school that she was put in charge of. And so what she did was she set out to shift police culture from a warrior mentality to what they call a guardian mentality. In this next scene, she's standing out there in front of there's this big mural that's at the very entrance to the police training center, and you can see the words up there. It says, "In these halls, training the guardians of democracy." And every desk in the training center has this laminated card on it that contain the word LEAD, L-E-E-D, which is an acronym. LEAD, which stands for Listen and Explain with Equity and Dignity. And these are known as the 4 pillars of what is being called justice-based policing. Now here's how she explains her philosophy. In law enforcement, she explains, empathy is still viewed as a weakness or catering to political correctness. But really, it's critical to officer safety. Police officers deal with people in crisis, and having your trauma acknowledged lowers the tension. Listening is a de-escalation strategy. So, how's it working? Well, the research is really just getting underway. This is new stuff. We're talking 2012. It takes a little while for the research to have robust studies that really demonstrate what's happening, but so far preliminary studies have shown that the officers who receive lead training use force 30% less often than their peers and make fewer arrests in situations involving mentally ill persons, opting instead for hospitalization, which is a good thing because it's far more effective at dealing with the situation, at dealing with mental illness. Incarceration is one of the worst ways to deal with it because you're going to see them again. Hospitalization stands a better chance of stopping the problem. Now the second example, this is something that I was not aware of. I just love learning new things like this. I wasn't aware of it, but I'm sure that you current and former teachers are probably aware of it. It's something called social emotional learning. Anyone social emotional learning? I see some hands up, people that have heard of it are familiar with it. It's abbreviated SEL. It's a process where, where children and adults learn how to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, and establish and maintain positive relationships and make responsible decisions. We should be teaching this. If we're not already, we should be teaching this in a very explicit, intentional way to children who are just old enough to begin to start to understand and get them as soon as possible, right? One manifestation of this process is something called the kindness curriculum, which was developed by the University of Wisconsin. They have an organization there called the Center for Healthy Minds, and so they try to get school districts around the country to adopt these programs. And these programs have actually been around long enough to have been extensively researched, all right? And this is what they found about them. A recent review of more than 200 studies, including about 250,000 students, demonstrates that SEL programs make a difference. After participating in them, students better understand one another's feelings and control their own moods. Other benefits are more tangible. SEL programs decrease bullying, depression, and disciplinary troubles and raise GPAs. Now, the only downside with SEL is that it doesn't seem to work very well with teenagers for a variety of reasons, right? So if you don't get them young, it's almost impossible to get them when they become adolescents. So, of course, the lesson here is you have to start young, and then the results seem to carry over. Now, I have no idea how extensively this has been adopted in our school systems. According to one organization that keeps track, at least probably this one from the University of Wisconsin, the kindness curriculum, it's been adopted in 20 school districts nationwide, including Sacramento. And maybe there are other offshoots of this that are being used more pervasively, but as far as I'm concerned, I'd like to see something like this in every school system. So these are just a few of the ways that we actually see people intentionally trying to build kind systems and to shift culture, to change our norms, starting with Jesus over 2,000 years ago, and now with SURAR and the SEL programs. And what they all have in common is that it requires people to choose to internalize these new norms and then live them and model them so that more people out there will be affected by them and will respond to them like I don't know, kind of like a benevolent virus, I guess, that moves through the culture. So next week we're going to look at how literature and the arts can contribute to empathy. And we'll also talk about something called the Kindness Challenge, which is a program that's being started by Unity. That's next week. We'll see you then. Thank you.